So, welcome to the first face-to-face lecture. Just a reminder, this is the textbook. You can buy the 11th edition as well. The only real difference is this talks about the 2018 midterm elections and a bit about the Trump administration, but the other version is fine as well. So if you can get the 11th edition and it's cheaper, by all means, go ahead. I'm not going to make you guys spend a couple $100 on a textbook that you'll use for one semester and then sell back for half the price you paid for it. Okay. So, might help if I click on the screen. Getting the hang of this whole, virtual kind of class thing, so we'll get there. Okay. Here's a way to make this bigger, but I don't think it'll let me. All right. A little bit. Okay. So, sorry it's a little small, but it's so the people online can see this as well. So, we talked about American political culture last week. Today, we're going to talk about the Revolutionary War a little bit. The first form of government and the creation of the Constitution. So more of a background on kind of how our government is formed and how it works. So as we're going along, if you have questions or you need something repeated, just let me know. And for those of you online, if you have a question or need something repeated, you can type it into the chat box, or you can go ahead and use the hand raising icon at the bottom of your screen. Okay. So some of this will be familiar from your history classes. So we had, of course, 13 colonies, but there were 5 major interest groups competing for influence and power. The elite largely controlled the power. The planters, especially the tobacco planters, the merchants, and the people who worked for the British government. These were the elite groups in the colonies, the ones who had land and the money. On the other hand, you had the so-called radicals, the shopkeepers, the laborers, the small farmers, kind of the haves and the have-nots. And like any group, of course, they were competing for resources and power. So the elite groups were usually a little bit better at holding the radicals in check. And when they were fighting against each other, they weren't really fighting against the British government. Okay, the audio is a little unclear. Okay. Okay. So, all right. It's gonna look weird, but students can't hear me through my mask, so I'm gonna try to talk like this. I know it looks weird, but I gotta make sure they can hear me online. Okay. Is that better for you guys online? Can you hear me a little bit better now? A little? Okay. I'll try to speak as clearly as I can for them. So keep in mind, there's always that conflict between the haves and the have-nots, right? The people who have the power and the people who don't. So talk about the colonial period, right, you often hear the phrase taxation without representation. There's some truth to that, and there's some not truth to that. The colonies actually weren't paying that much in taxes. It was hard to enforce British tax policy outside the major cities. To force a farmer in the middle of nowhere in Pennsylvania to pay their taxes. And part of the reason taxes had to be increased was because the British were paying so much money to protect the colonies. They had to protect them from the pirates at sea. They had to protect them from the French, from the Native Americans. So the British Empire was spending a lot of money on the colonies, but not really getting their fair share back. So they decided, well, we're going to have to increase the taxes. What we think of as income tax didn't really exist until the 20th century. We didn't have a federal income tax in the United States until the late 19-teens, 1920s. So taxes were placed on goods, products, tea, sugar, molasses, stamps, things like that, to help pay for the cost of protecting the colonies. And this is when we started to see the radicals and the elites coming together, because now everybody was feeling the financial pressure, having to pay more for goods and services. And so there were two events that really helped spark the revolution. The first was the Boston Massacre. Big fight in what is now the Boston Common. Some of the colonists threw rocks at British soldiers. The British soldiers responded by opening fire on the colonists and killing 5 of them. Now, in the U.S. media, this was portrayed as the killing of innocent, unarmed colonists. Not exactly, but they did help to bring people together and say, if the British are going to kill us for protesting, we're going to have to do something more about this. So, after the Boston Massacre, you get the famous Boston Tea Party, where Sam Adams and a group of people dress up like Native Americans, board the British vessels, and toss the tea into the harbor. And it was, for its time, an act of terrorism. They were destroying British property. And so the British responded by closing the port of Boston, sending the accused to trial in the UK, and not allowing people to move west. So this also helped get the elites to see that the movement for independence would benefit them as well. It wasn't an elites versus radicals anymore, it was the colonists versus the British. So these were the events that kind of brought the groups together in their opposition to the British. Forget it. Like I know I'm supposed to be wearing a mask, but Dan's gonna be able to hear me. Okay. Have any of you actually been to Boston, by the way? Anyone visited? Yeah? Did you, would you?
I'm doing with the study.
Mm-hmm.
From Boston.
Yeah.
From the city.
Okay. Yeah.
I didn't see any historical. I went to Washington.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, I lived in Boston for 4 years, and if you go, there's actually like the historical trail. They have a plaque to the Boston Massacre. You can see where Paul Revere is buried, Sam Adams. So it's actually kind of cool. And fun little trivia fact. Sam Adams wasn't responsible for the beer, but it was named after him. But people who go to Boston will sometimes leave a bottle of Sam Adams beer on his grave as like a tribute. It's kind of fun. So if you go and you see the historical sites, it can be really, really interesting. So then, of course, we decide we've had enough of British rule, we've had enough of this nonsense, we're going to rebel against the British Empire. So Thomas Jefferson writes the famous Declaration of Independence, right? Where he basically outlines all the reasons why we're going to rebel against the British. It was a very radical work for its time. He argued that we have an inherent right to liberty and the pursuit of happiness. He based this off of the work of John Locke, a very popular British philosopher. Now, John Locke argued that we had the right to life, liberty, and property. But arguing the right to property gets contentious, so Jefferson changed to the right to the pursuit of happiness. He also made a very interesting argument against the prevailing philosophy of the divine right of kings. Any of you heard of this philosophy, this idea? No? Okay. So, up until the mid to late 1800s, the argument was made that a monarch got his power from God. So if you were to go against your king, you were going against God. So you were never to rebel against your king. Thomas Jefferson said that's ridiculous, that kings get their power through the people, that it's us that gives them legitimacy. And therefore, if the king is not doing what we want him to, we have the right to rebel against him. So again, a very radical idea for the time, that kings were human, and that we had the right to hold them accountable if we didn't like what they were doing. But it was, of course, a very important and significant document, because this led to later events like the French Revolution and others. So it's one of those documents that has really stood the test of time. It's been cited in other constitutions, declarations of independence, protests against dictators, and so on. I do not have headphones. I will look into getting some to improve the audio a bit for you guys. I'll see what I can do for those of you online. Yeah, I'll look into that, guys. Okay. So we have, of course, the revolution, and then we win, and then we have to figure out how to form a government, which, by the way, is one of the hardest decisions a country can ever make. What kind of government do we want? How do we want it to work? So our first attempt at a government was the Articles of Confederation. And we can think of the Articles of Confederation as somewhat similar to the modern day United Nations. Each country has a vote, but it has its own rules, its own currency, its own language, and so on. So each state had sovereignty. Each state had the right to pass its own laws, which obviously makes things a bit complicated. There was no president, no central head of state. We've just gotten rid of a king. We weren't really in them to, put another one in his place. And the type of Congress we had was very different from the one we have today. The state legislatures would send their representatives to this Congress. They were paid by their state, and if they did something the state didn't like, they could be sent back. Each state only got one vote, and if they were going to make changes to the Articles of Confederation, it required a unanimous vote, which of course is next to impossible to get on anything, let alone changing the government. So what ended up happening was that it wasn't a unified country. Every state was on its own. Every state had to conduct its own foreign affairs. When John Adams went to England to negotiate a post-war peace treaty, the British said, "You don't have a central government. We'll negotiate with each state independently." So 13 peace treaties instead of one. And of course, a state like Virginia was going to get a better peace deal because it was growing tobacco versus another state. So limited in the ability to do anything domestically, no ability to deal with the big powers at the time were the British Empire, the French, and the Spanish. Where they were able to negotiate, so to speak, was in the Land Ordinance and the Northwest Ordinance, where we expanded westward, where we added some more states. But the rebellion that came after Shays' Rebellion really did show that Congress just couldn't get anything organized very quickly. The farmers in western Massachusetts were rebelling against the landowners, were rebelling against the courts for foreclosing on their farms. So they took up weapons, shut down the courts, and started to march on the National Armory, which was then in Springfield, Massachusetts. So what ended up happening was the state of Massachusetts asked Congress for help to end the rebellion. And Congress couldn't get it together in time. Congress could not find a way to solve the problem. So the state government was able to solve the problem. But if they hadn't, that might have been the end of the United States. So it became clear that this type of government was just not going to work. It wasn't feasible. It just wasn't a possibility. Can you guys hear me a little better now? Okay. Maybe I'll just try putting it there instead, see if that helps. Okay, any questions? No, okay. Any questions online? Okay. Is a lot of this familiar to you guys? History classes and all that? Okay. Yeah. Okay. So then, of course, we have to rewrite our government. We have to reform the government. So we get the famous Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. And there's been a lot of debate about what the motivations were for the Founding Fathers. Did they do it to put themselves into power? Were they creating a system that was in line with contemporary moral beliefs? The answer's somewhere in the middle, right? Did they hope to benefit from the system? Sure. But they were also hoping to create a long-term government. They didn't want to have to rewrite the Constitution in 2 years or 5 years. They wanted a government that would last. So they began debating how to create a form of government that would work, how to make the big states and the small states happy. And one of the first arguments that came up was how to create the legislative body. The larger states, like Virginia, wanted the members chosen by population. And the smaller states said, well, that's not fair. You'll always have an advantage. It should be equal representation. So they went back and forth for a while, and eventually they landed on what became known as the Great Compromise. The House of Representatives is chosen by the popular vote. Let me rephrase that. The House of Representatives is based on a state's population. So a state like Texas is going to have more representatives than a state like Wyoming, right? Because we have a much larger population. That was a compromise for the large states. For the small states, the compromise was the Senate. Equal number of senators, no matter how large the state. That's why Texas only gets 2 senators, despite being 5 or 6 times the size of Rhode Island. It was a way to keep the big states and the small states happy. Let me see. Okay. Also, the Senate was originally chosen by the state legislature, not by the people. This did change in the 20th century, but originally we were not supposed to choose the senators. The other big fight that happened was over slavery. It wasn't a moral argument. There was opposition to slavery on a moral level, but Congress wasn't willing to deal with the idea of slavery on a moral ground. The constitutional delegates were like, we can't have this argument, we'll have to put it to the side. The argument they were having was over how to count the slaves. The larger states said, we want them counted as people. The smaller states and the abolitionists said, if they're people, then they should have the rights of citizens and they shouldn't be treated like property. So they went back and forth on the issue and eventually settled on what became known as the 3/5 compromise. Every third slave out of a group of 5 would be counted as part of the population. So they'd put 5 slaves in a line, they would count that third one, and they would say that counts as a person for representation. It wasn't an ideal compromise, certainly not the best solution, but they wanted to get on to more important issues. And at the time, of course, for a lot of people, slavery was not seen as immoral. So they weren't willing to tackle the issue. They said, well, deal with it further down the line. We don't have the time to deal with this particular issue now. So they just kind of shunted it to the side out of necessity. Okay, so our Constitution, of course, created a bicameral legislature, meaning 2 chambers, the House of Representatives and the Senate. Every state except Nebraska has a bicameral legislature. Nebraska only has one chamber. No idea why they did it that way. Guess they wanted to be different. So every state has a state house and a state senate except Nebraska. The Constitution also created a system of checks and balances so that no one branch could completely dominate the others. They also separated out the powers, right? The legislative branch can pass laws. The Supreme Court reviews constitutional issues. The president has certain powers. So every branch was given its own powers and the ability to be a check on the others, to make sure the president isn't violating the law, that Congress isn't passing legislation that goes against the Constitution. We also saw the creation of federalism. There is divided power between the states and the federal government. Federal government, of course, has most of the power, but there are some powers given to the states through the 10th Amendment. So we have a system of divided power sharing. The national government gets some power, the states get the other. That way, the federal government can't just dominate the states completely, override them whenever they feel like it. And we also have indirect elections. We do not directly elect the president. That's done by the Electoral College. So we don't directly elect the president. We didn't used to directly elect the Senate. And of course, we don't get any real say in who's on the Supreme Court. So by and large, it is a system of indirect elections, indirect appointments. It's not a direct democracy. It's a representative democracy. We're going to break down the branches of government. The first, of course, is the legislative branch, made up of the House and the Senate. The House of Representatives is 2-year terms, so every member only gets 2 years, and they are and always have been directly elected, which means, hypothetically, this year, if we wanted, we could vote out every single member of the House of Representatives and elect a whole new body. Is that likely? No. Is it possible? Yeah. So every 2 years, the entire House of Representatives is up for re-election. The Senate is a little bit different. Senators get 6 years, and only a third of the Senate is up for re-election at any time. This is on purpose. We don't want the entire Senate being replaced at the same time. So it's a staggered election system. The Senate was designed to be the more robust, mature body. The idea was that it would be made up of elder statesmen, people with lots of experience. So the Senate was originally elected by the state legislatures, not the people. It was the 17th Amendment that changed that, that made it so we can directly elect our senators. So in November of this year, the entire House of Representatives is up for re-election, as is a third of the Senate. And we have a Senate seat up for re-election. John Cornyn is up for re-election this year. So we'll have to see if he holds on to the seat or not. So the House has always been designed to be the direct consent for citizens, to be the body of government that is the most responsive to the people. If we don't like what a member of the House is doing, we can always kick them out of office, right? We can say, shape up or we'll pick someone else instead. So the House was always designed to be responsive to us. The Senate was not designed that way. It was supposed to be more resistant to our demands, more immune. But the reality is, of course, with the senators being elected, they are now more directly responsive to the people. They do have to pay attention to what their constituents want. Obviously, it's a bit harder for a senator. How does Ted Cruz know what's good for the people of Austin and the people of Weslaco? It's a lot harder to figure that out. And Congress gets its power through two different means. The first is through the powers given to them in the Constitution. These are the expressed powers. The power to pass laws, create taxes, declare war, impeach the president. These are specifically outlined in the body of the Constitution. But the Founding Fathers were also smart enough to recognize that Congress has to be flexible. So the elastic clause gives Congress the ability to pass laws as needed, to pass emergency relief after a natural disaster. Less than 2 weeks after 9/11, we had the Patriot Act. So because of the elastic clause, Congress can respond to a crisis a lot more quickly. They can say, we'll create emergency relief funding for Louisiana and Texas after Hurricane Laura, or we'll send out a stimulus check to battle COVID, right? A lot of people getting a check for about $1,200. Keep in mind, we do have to pay that back next year when we file our taxes. So it's a temporary kind of loan thing they gave us, but the idea was to stimulate the economy a little bit, give the people some money to go out and spend, go out, help the local economy. Did any of you get a stimulus check? Yeah, I did. I was like, ooh, yay, I'm gonna go out and buy a car. No, can't do anything with this. But the idea was there, right? The idea is people will spend the money somewhat. Did help a little. Okay, so the executive branch, originally we didn't want a central leader. We just gotten rid of the king. We don't want a head of state. But they realized that you had to have someone in charge of the country. So the executive branch was created to try and help deal with the legislative branch. If Congress deadlocks, the president and the vice president are supposed to step in to help fix the problem. Now, the president is supposed to be independent from Congress. It's not really true anymore, right? The president is often sparring with Congress, trying to get them to pass legislation. But the idea was that it would help with issues in the legislative branch. And it has somewhat. The various cabinet departments take some of the pressure off Congress to run the various bureaucracies. And so the president is given certain powers that only belong to him, right? He, and hopefully someday she, can accept ambassadors, can negotiate treaties. They can represent the U.S. abroad. They can send troops abroad briefly. They are the commander-in-chief of the military. And the president does have the special power of the pardon. Every year, the president will be given a list of people who have filed for a pardon, and every year he usually pardons a handful of people. Usually, it's for non-violent drug offenses, but there are exceptions like Crystal Kaiser. She was a sex trafficking victim who killed one of her clients, largely in self-defense. She'd been put in jail for a very long time, and she received a pardon from President Trump. Sometimes they can be controversial. When President Ford pardoned former President Nixon for Watergate, there was a lot of outrage. A lot of people who said, did you make some kind of backdoor deal where he agreed to step down if you agreed to pardon him? Also, the pardoning of Chelsea Manning for her involvement in WikiLeaks, that was pretty controversial as well. But usually it's nonviolent drug offenders. They look at them and they say, you shouldn't have gotten 50 years for marijuana possession. We're going to toss that out. So it's at the president's prerogative. And the president is not directly elected. The president is elected through the Electoral College. We are going to talk more about that later. But essentially, the Electoral College is 538 individuals who help to elect the president. Each state is given a certain number of electors based on how many representatives they have in the House, plus their 2 senators. So we have something like 38 electors in Texas. For a candidate to win, they have to get 270 out of 538 electoral votes, which means that the winner of the popular vote isn't necessarily the winner of the Electoral College. We've had 4 elections in history where that happened, 2016 being the most recent. So it's not a direct election of the president. It's actually a very small body that does elect the president. Most of the time, the winner of the popular vote is the winner of the Electoral College, but not always. Yes. Good question. I believe they're replaced every 4 years. They're chosen by the state parties. So the Texas Democrats will choose who they want to vote for Joe Biden. And the Texas Republicans will pick who votes for Donald Trump. So they're chosen by the state parties. Yeah, so they're chosen by the state parties. And usually they're replaced every 4 years, because you don't want an elector getting too cozy. Chosen by the state parties. Good question. Any other questions? Okay, any questions online? Okay. All right, so the last branch, of course, is the judicial branch, which is the federal courts and the U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is basically the court that decides how to resolve a problem between state and federal government. If state law contradicts federal law, the Supreme Court will likely hear a case about that. If there's a challenge to federal legislation, usually it ends up before the Supreme Court. It is the highest court in the United States. It's the court of last resort. The decisions that are made there are final. There's no other court to appeal your case. The only court that can overturn a Supreme Court decision is the Supreme Court. And they have done that a few times. For example, Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, that was actually them overturning Plessy versus Ferguson. But if they don't overturn the decision, that's it. And it has to be applied all across the U.S. When the Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage in 2015, every state had to allow for same-sex marriage. They couldn't refuse to marry same-sex couples. And it is a lifetime appointment on the court to keep them from being pressured by Congress or by the people. Most justices die on the bench, to be blunt about it. They can technically be impeached, but usually either they retire or they die on the court. And some of them have literally died in the courtroom. Yeah, yeah. Which isn't that funny, but it kind of is at the same time. Yeah, yeah. So the court makes the final decisions regarding any interpretation of the Constitution, or when there's a difference between state and federal law. The Supremacy Clause does say that national laws are superior to state or local laws. So if the state of Texas wanted to pass a law saying marriage is between one man and one woman, it would be struck down by the court because they've already said marriage is between two consenting adults no matter what their gender. So if a state or a local county, for example, passes a law that contradicts federal law, it will likely end up before the Supreme Court. Abortion laws, for example, abortion restrictions, more often than not end up in federal courts. So the Constitution was designed with some limits in place. Each branch has its own powers, and they all have control over each other. The president can veto a congressional resolution. Congress controls if a treaty gets ratified. The Senate approves a Supreme Court appointee or cabinet position. The Supreme Court can overturn a law or an executive order. So, for example, President Trump's first so-called Muslim ban was struck down by the Supreme Court because it was too broad. When he narrowed it down a bit more, that was upheld by the courts. So they all have control over each other, so that one branch cannot completely dominate the others. It's also a bit of a mixed regime. The president is chosen through the Electoral College. Congress is now chosen through the people, although, of course, for the Senate that didn't change until the 17th Amendment. And the Supreme Court, the president nominates someone and the Senate confirms. So we really only have a say directly in Congress, right? We don't have a say in who's on the Supreme Court. We can try to ask Congress or our senators not to put someone on the court, but we don't get really any say in it. So it is, in a lot of ways, a representative democracy. And another limit on the federal government is the bills, is what protects us from government overreach. It wasn't part of the Constitution originally, and some of the founding fathers, including Alexander Hamilton, tried to argue that it was redundant, that we already knew where the government was limited in its power. But the successful argument was made that we had to make it clear what protections we have from the government, from government overreach, freedom of speech, not executing someone for shoplifting, things like that. So the Bill of Rights is a limit on what the government can and can't do to its own citizens. Right? It's why someone can't be put in jail for 5 years without a trial. Those rights help protect us from the government. Okay, so the Constitution gets created, but it has to be ratified. So there's two sets of arguments that are published in the newspapers. The arguments in favor, and of course the arguments against. So the arguments in favor are called the Federalist Papers. They were written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. And they outlined why the Constitution was necessary, explained to the people the role of the government, how it would work, how it would protect the rights of the citizens. Then you had the counter-argument, which basically said this will lead to elite control. The few will dominate the many. And it's not going to work. That the government will be controlled by a very small group of people and the rest of us will lose out. So the counter-argument that was made by the Federalists said that's not going to happen because we've put enough limits into place to prevent that from happening. The people get a say in who's in the House of Representatives. The government clearly has what it can and can't do, and protections for the people. So they made the argument that the Constitution limits the ability for people to abuse the system, but there's enough checks and balances in place that this wouldn't be an issue. And the Federalists also argued that you can use the internal controls in the Constitution to prevent abuse. When a president abuses his powers like President Nixon did in Watergate, he ended up having to resign, right? Because Congress was going to impeach and remove him from office. So there are controls on the ability to abuse power. A Supreme Court justice can be impeached. Members of Congress can be removed from office through elections. So the idea is that there are protections already in place. And the Federalists were more successful for two reasons. One, that they were able to more articulate the arguments in favor, and two, because the Anti-Federalists simply said, we don't like this Constitution, but we can't agree on what form of government we should have instead. And so the people looked at them and said, okay, but we have to have something. We can't have this loose system. It's not going to work anymore. So if you don't have a better idea, you might as well take a chance on the Constitution. So the Constitution was ratified. People knew there was a need for a better government, that the existing system just wasn't going to work. Okay, so if we want to make a change to the Constitution, I know this is a little difficult to read. There's two ways for a constitutional amendment to be proposed. The first is by a two-thirds majority vote of the House and a two-thirds majority vote in the Senate. The other way is by having a constitutional amendment convention called by two-thirds of the states. For the most part, constitutional amendments have been introduced by Congress. It's faster than trying to get the states to agree on holding a convention, when, how, etc. Once an amendment has been proposed, there's two ways it can be ratified. The first is through 3/4 of the state legislatures, or by 3/4 of a ratifying convention that's been called. Again, for the most part, it's done by the state legislatures because, again, it's easier than trying to call a constitutional convention. So Congress, for the most part, introduces a possible amendment, and then it's up to the state legislatures to ratify a particular amendment. So, since the ratification of the Constitution in 1789, over 11,000 amendments have been proposed, but only 29 have ever been officially proposed for ratification. Mostly because amendments are seen as redundant or something that could be handled by passing congressional legislation, so a lot of them die before they reach the floors of Congress. Out of those 29 proposed amendments, only 27 have been ratified. The last amendment to be added, the 27th, basically says Congress can't give itself a pay raise in election year. But we haven't amended the Constitution since the early 1990s. So it's actually been a while since we've had a proposed constitutional amendment. Constitutional amendments, by and large, are used to protect our rights in some way. You can't propose an amendment to get around legislation. For example, There was the argument someone made that we should create a constitutional amendment to get rid of the Affordable Care Act. Well, that's not going to happen. Congress won't allow that, right? They're not going to allow you to get rid of legislation through a permanent constitutional amendment. We've only had one constitutional amendment repealed in history. The 18th Amendment, which outlawed alcohol in this country, was repealed by the 21st. That's the only time in history we've actually repealed an amendment. We have seen some amendments succeed in promoting social change, for example, giving women the right to vote, giving African Americans the right to vote. But by and large, an amendment that's created with the idea of promoting large social change doesn't succeed. And an example of this is the infamous Equal Rights Amendment from the early 1970s. It was created in response to the women's rights movement, and what the amendment would have done would have outlawed discrimination on the basis of gender. Keep in mind, at this time, women were being paid significantly less than men. If you looked at the newspaper, there'd be jobs for men on the left hand and jobs for women on the right. Women weren't allowed to get a credit card without permission from their husbands or their fathers. So obviously there were some changes that needed to be made. But there was a fair amount of opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment. Some argued that women are already protected by the 14th Amendment, that we don't need a special amendment of our own. There's also the argument that it was too radical, that it would force women to have to enter the military draft like men, that it would create unisex bathrooms in all workplaces. A lot of fear-mongering around this particular amendment. And unfortunately, it was not ratified. It had a deadline to be ratified by the states, and it did not meet that deadline. So the Equal Rights Amendment is essentially dead. Now there have been laws passed to try and fix some of the issues from the Equal Rights Amendment. The Lilly Ledbetter Act for equal pay. You can't segregate jobs on men versus women and that kind of thing. So some changes have been made, but the Equal Rights Amendment is dead. Not likely to be reintroduced or passed again. So sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And there's a good mini-series on this whole issue on Hulu. It's called Mrs. America. It's about the leading opponent of the ERA. Her name was Phyllis Schlafly, and she was very successful in killing this proposed amendment. So if you're interested in learning more about why it died, that's a pretty good show to watch. Any questions, comments? Yes. Oh, yes, Eileen. Oh.
What was that show called?
Mrs. America. Yep. Yeah. Mrs. America, I think it came out earlier this year. I tried to watch it. I just couldn't. I was just like, I really wanted this amendment, and I was just kind of mad about it. I was like, okay. But if you're interested in learning more about it, you can also just look up the woman, Phyllis. May misspell that, but I think this is how you spell her name, Phyllis Schlafly. If you want to know more about who she was and what she did on the amendment. Okay. And by and large, it has been the Supreme Court who has reinterpreted the Constitution as needed. We have rights given to us in the Bill of Rights, but it wasn't until the mid-20th century that we really got these rights handed to us by the court. The Fifth Amendment gives us the right to remain silent, protection from self-incrimination. But it wasn't until Miranda v. Arizona that the cops had to start telling us that, right? The famous, you have the right to remain silent, anything you say can and will be used against you. Sixth Amendment gives us the right to a lawyer, but it wasn't until Gideon v. Wainwright that the court said, if you can't afford one, then you can have one appointed instead. So the Supreme Court has had to reinterpret the amendments throughout history to make sure we're getting our constitutionally protected rights. And we'll talk more about that when we get into civil liberties. But a lot of the rights we take for granted today, we've only had for about 50 years. They're not that old. The court has also taken an interesting approach to the idea of a right to privacy. Nowhere in the Constitution do we have a guaranteed right to privacy. But with the 14th Amendment, the court has said it does give us a right to privacy. The 14th Amendment guarantees equal protection under the law. So the 14th Amendment has been used to give women access to contraception, to legalize abortion in Roe v. Wade, to legalize same-sex marriage in 2015. Nowhere in the Constitution does it talk about contraception or marriage rights. But over time, the court's been asked to take on these issues. And so they've reinterpreted the Constitution as necessary to protect our rights. And the justices on the court tend to fall into two categories. The more liberal justices will argue that the Constitution is a living, breathing document, that it's subject to change when needed. And of course, in 1789, nobody would have thought about cell phones, right? But the court's been asked to deal with issues like this. And just FYI, the police cannot search your cell phone without your consent or a warrant. So if you are detained and a cop says, give me your phone, you have the right to tell them not without a warrant. And if they search your phone, that's an illegal search and seizure. And that's because the court has reinterpreted the Fourth Amendment to give us a right to privacy with technology. Cops can't put a GPS tracker on our car without a warrant. I mean, who the hell would have thought of that in 1789, right? But for some justices, they say, look, the Constitution's a living, breathing document that has to be changed as necessary to keep up with the times. The more conservative justices will argue that the court should limit its decisions to a very strict interpretation of the Constitution. And if that issue is not in the Constitution, they shouldn't hear the case. So for example, on the issue of same-sex marriage, one of the justices said, it's not in the Constitution, so it's a state issue. We don't have grounds on which to hear this case. Obviously, that wasn't the majority opinion. But sometimes you'll get the more conservative justices saying this isn't in the Constitution. We should send it back to the lower courts, to Congress, to the states. This is not an issue we should take up. You'll get some back and forth on should the Constitution be subject to change or should we strictly interpret it? By and large, the argument that it's a living Constitution has won out. You can't apply 18th century law to 21st century issues. We can't rewrite the Constitution with every societal change. If we want to keep our Constitution largely as it is, then we have to be able to reinterpret it as needed, to expand the right to ask for a warrant, not only for our houses, but our cars, our laptops, our cell phones. To say, you know what, women do have the right to contraception, and it's nobody's business but their own, right? Morals and society changes over time. So the idea that we should limit our interpretation to a 200-year-old document isn't as popular compared to the argument that it's a living, breathing document that has to be changed as society changes. Okay, any questions, comments? Okay, any questions online? Okay. All right. I'm gonna go ahead and, okay. So you guys are the Tuesday cohort, so you'll come next Tuesday. Thursday, you're online. If you can join the lecture like some of your classmates did during class time, great. If you can't, that's fine. The lectures are recorded and they are uploaded to YouTube. Under course content, there is a link to the YouTube channel where you can see the videos. So Thursday, we're going to start talking about federalism. So the other half of the class will be here, and you guys will be online. Any questions on that? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and